Thank you very much, Vanessa, for the introduction. And my name is Nelson Kinnersley, and I'd like to thank the STEM organisers for all their work to put today's event and the whole 3 days of events on. I'd also like to thank Julie Kinnersley for her work in preparing many of the slides that you're going to see today. So as Vanessa said, my name is Nelson Kinnersley, and I use maths every day in my work. Although today I'll try to give you an insight to what inspired me many years ago to actually think about a job that does use maths. There are a couple of places during today's talk where I'll be pausing, and that's going to allow you time to discuss amongst yourselves with your teachers the questions that I'll set for you during this talk. But first, I want to take you back in time. Before you were born, there were spacecrafts called space shuttles that were sent into space by NASA, the American Space Agency. They looked a lot like aeroplanes rather than the kind of rockets whose images you may have seen being sent to the moon. In 1986, a space shuttle called Challenger sadly exploded after takeoff, killing all the people on board. The reason for the explosion was that a ring inside the shuttle, known as an O-ring, had split. The O-ring was a bit like a giant rubber washer that you put inside a house tap to stop the tap from leaking water. The O-ring was supposed to stop the rocket fuel from leaking into the rest of the space shuttle, but it cracked. And when the fuel mixed with the oxygen inside the shuttle, there was an explosion. Now, before the aircraft took off, the engineers and the managers of the launch knew there had been sometimes problems with the O-ring. And so they calculated the risk that the O-ring would crack on the next launch, which was to be the Challenger's launch. The risk is also known as the probability. It's a topic in maths you may have heard about, and you'll study some more in the years to come. But in the case of the Challenger calculations, they were not correct. They got the probability wrong. The managers at NASA didn't understand the maths, and so they allowed the Challenger to launch, even though the actual risk of failure was in fact too high. So maths is obviously a vital and very important tool in engineering and space exploration, as well as other areas like medicine. But we see maths in use around us every day, not just in very serious situations. So let's look at how manufacturers of food tell you how much food you're buying. People in everyday life don't often use the word mass. They say weight, but the correct term in maths is mass. And you'll understand why that is later in secondary school. The mass of the chocolate bar in the image is 32 grams. Or is it? Can you see the little e written before the 32 grams? E stands for estimate. People whose job it is to make sure you understand what you're paying for invented the E system. When chocolate bars are manufactured by Cadbury's, they don't just make one at a time, they make thousands at a time. Now, in the old days, it was quite hard for manufacturers as they had to make sure every single bar weighed the right amount, which was the amount shown on the wrapper. This was time-consuming and expensive. Also, little manufacturing errors occurred. So sometimes the wrong amount of chocolate went into the wrapper. So to make the process of checking the mass of each and every chocolate bar easier, they started using averages or means. Do you remember the word mean? So Cadbury's weigh, in general, a whole batch of flakes. Let's suppose there are 100 of them in the batch. So in this batch of 100 bars, the total weight, the total mass, 3,200 grams. And then they divided that 3,200 by 100, because there are 100 bars, to get the number 32, or 32 grams. And so what they're doing here is finding the mean mass of one flake. So when you buy a flake that's 32 grams, is actually the average mass of one flake calculated from a big batch of flakes. I'm going to show you now something that you could try when you're at home. Buy a sample of chocolate bars. I've chosen flake, but you can choose your own favorite for this. One thing is, though, they must all have the identical mass stamped on them. Next, you can find or you can borrow some weighing scales, or maybe you can do this at school and use the scales that you have at school. But here is one such digital scales in the image. Remove the wrappers and weigh each one in turn. Record or write down the mass of each one. You may just about be able to make out the digital values on this scale, but I've also put them on this slide. So here we have 31.05 grams in the first top left image, then 33.15 in the top right. Bottom left, it's 32.85, and bottom right, 33.00 grams. So how will you work out the average mass from this sample of 4 flake bars? I'll give you 5 minutes to discuss this amongst yourselves and with your teachers, and then we'll come back to the Zoom. So at this stage, it's 9:18 on mine. Let's aim to be back at 9:23. By the way, if while you're doing this, you want to ask any questions, I've also got the chat window open as well as Vanessa has. So I can see in the chat that some of them are progressing with these calculations. Hope that the discussion at your respective schools is going okay, and don't hesitate to ask any clarifying questions. But as a reminder, the question is, how would you calculate the mean, the average mass? Okay, going to give you just one more minute and then I'll bring everybody back and continue with it. So those of you who are still working on it, if you can start to wrap up, that would be helpful. And if the teachers could give a thumbs up in the Zoom, that will also give me a signal.
Quite a few thumbs up then. I'm not sure if you're able to see that screen.
Yeah, actually, I was just looking around for it. No. Okay, in which case we have had the 5 minutes, so I will move on to get through. Thank you for participating in that. And I can see a few of the answers are matching each other. There's a few slight variations on it, and that in itself can indicate some good discussion here. So let's go through. So we have a total mass of the 4 flakes by adding up. Hopefully this is what you saw, 130.05 grams. And so to get the mean mass of the 4 flakes, we take 130.05 and divide it by the 4. And in my case, I've rounded it to 2 decimal places. So that's 0.51. And I see that a number of you put that. Others did to 4 decimal places, so 32.5125. Others had done some other roundings up and said, well, to no decimal places, or so-called to integers, it's 33. And so, as I say, I've just encouraged you at your schools just to have a discussion of that after we finish or at some other convenient time. But I'm going to move on at this point. So, and just to make the point that, you know, when you buy your next favorite food or sweet, perhaps you'll get lucky and you'll get a bit more than it says on the wrapper. Or maybe you'll get unlucky and get less than it says on the wrapper. The average mass of the 4 flake bars was actually more than 32 grams, as it says on the slide, 32.51 grams to 2 decimal places. And here's another challenge for you. Did Cadbury's get it wrong? Why isn't the mean 32 grams exactly? I'm going to give you, let's say, 4 minutes to discuss this amongst yourselves, and then we'll come back to the Zoom. So the question is, why isn't the mean 32 grams exactly? And did Cadbury's get it wrong? So I make it 9:25. We'll come back at about 9:29. I can see some of the teachers putting answers into the chat. That's great. I'm also encouraging you to discuss amongst yourselves at the school, and feel free to put more than one of the answers from the class. You can see quite a rich variety of answers coming through here. This is great to see the possible responses to this challenge. You can see a couple of common themes coming through here, and I'll touch on at least one of those when we regroup in about 30 seconds. So if the teachers could start to wrap up the discussions at your respective school, give the thumbs up, and Vanessa will be able to see that you're ready, and then share that with me.
We had 5 thumbs go up.
Okay.
Seven. 8. 9.
Okay, I think we'll carry on now with reply, and I can see that a number of the replies said that Cadbury's didn't get it wrong. Others were saying it was close enough. Some did say it was. There was mention there of the small number of flakes that were part of this. And so I've at least prepared my response to this. Let's see how we go on here. So the question was, did Cadbury's get it wrong? And my answer is no. We actually can't say that they got it wrong. And I'll take you through my reasoning for that. So I only had a sample of 4 flakes from the whole batch. That's a very small sample. I could have, and I probably did, pick some flakes that were mostly slightly heavier than 32 grams. So that's going to make my average mass, or my mean mass, slightly larger. If I'd bought an entire batch of flakes from Cadbury's and weighed them all to find the mean should be 32 grams. So I think I did see a number of the responses in the chat that were along this line. So that's great to see. But this is just the explanation based on my experience. So I want to tell you a little bit about my job. I'm a medical statistician, so I work in the development of new medicines. Every medicine that you take has been tested to make sure that firstly, it's safe, and secondly, it works. A medical statistician analyzes or checks the results to make sure that the results are accurate. One of my roles is to tell drug developers how many people we should give the drug to test if it works. If the sample of people the drug is given to is too small, then the mean values may be too high or too low. The results would not be accurate, which they obviously need to be. I use maths every day to make sure the information we get when medicines are being developed is as accurate as it can be. And I love my job. So at this point, I'm very happy to take any questions, either about the flake exercise, about maybe some of the discussions you had at your school, or anything about my job in developing new medicines. Over to the chats. And Vanessa, at some point I might need your assistance working with the chat here, but I'll also keep an eye on it myself.
I'm here.
Thank you.
So is your job quite dangerous? We've been asked by Leighton Middle School.
Thank you. I do not consider it dangerous. So most of my work is done on a computer. And so I'm doing calculations, I'm doing programming, I'm talking to doctors, I'm talking to other specialists who help develop the medicines. And so a number of these people arguably have got slightly more dangerous jobs than me. But no, I don't consider my job dangerous.
And another question from Nicola Guest. How many people do you have to sample with medicines?
Thank you.
What's kind of the average number, I guess?
Yeah, the average number. So different diseases require different number of people to study. And there's many factors go into that. But for example, some of the medicines that have been developed for people with heart disease test more than 15,000 patients. I'm sure many of you have been aware of the development of vaccines for COVID. Again, many, many thousands and thousands of patients. But at the other end of the spectrum are so-called rare diseases or ultra-rare diseases, where even in the whole world, there are fewer than 1,000 people who have the disease, sometimes in the small number of hundreds. Well, clearly, you can't test 15,000 people if there aren't 15,000 people who have the disease. So in those cases, you have to take a representative sample of those when you're developing drugs in rare diseases. So I'm afraid it's not possible to say there's one unique number, but typically it can be somewhere in the many, many hundreds to the thousands.
That's great. And Sandlings Primary School would like to know how many different medicines that you've worked on.
Great, thank you. So I've been working in this industry for 30 years, and sometimes I've been that statistician working on particular medicines. And so I could say I've worked on that medicine, and that would count, one towards that. Other times I've been a manager of statisticians working on that. And so I'm only indirectly. But if I include all of those, then probably I worked on about 50 different medicines in my career, many of which have been for life-threatening diseases, cancers, other rare diseases. And at other times it's been on infective diseases. I have worked on medicines being tested for COVID, for example.
And Boroughmore School's question, how many people would you test an inhaler on?
An inhaler, yeah. Gosh, it's probably been about 20 years since I've worked on an inhaler. So I'm just going to come back. So I probably have to qualify this answer. I've got a different talk that I've given to older secondary school, sort of year 12, and I go into the full medicines development. And as part of that, what I say, and I just share some of this information here, we start off testing a medicine in a small number of patients to make sure it's safe, and that may only be about 30, and that would be the case for in inhaler. If it's safe in those 30, we then go to bigger trials, maybe to a size 200, and check, does it work? Have we got confidence that it works? And if it works in those 200, then we'd move to much bigger worldwide studies of the hundreds or thousands. So probably for something like an inhaler, that it would be in the region of 800 to 1,000 people that would be the first time that a drug company would do a human clinical trial in that kind of 800, 1,000. Now, it doesn't just stop there. After they've done the initial tests and they've got a license from the governments around the world to sell this medicine, they do further clinical trials and test it further. For example, what is the best dose to give? If when you're looking on the package of a medicine, you see the dose, then they want to make sure that they've got the best dose, maybe for older people, maybe for younger people, maybe for people who've got other diseases as well as asthma. So I'm afraid that I can't just give one number, because the research and development keeps going to cater for the different types of age groups and other diseases people may have along with asthma, but certainly in the thousands.
Lots and lots of questions coming through on chat. If you were to get a calculation incorrect, what could happen?
I probably wouldn't sleep at night. That would be one thing. But also there could be serious consequences. However, the one thing that I want to make sure everybody knows is that the government in every country checks the work that's been done on these clinical trials before they grant a license for doctors to prescribe it. And so, because there are so many checking stages involved, and ultimately the governments in every country around the world that wants to sell the medicine are also checking the results, then it's unlikely that any mistake gets through before the medicine is approved. And this is why the development of new medicines is a so-called highly regulated industry, because every government around the world will be checking those numbers.
And Sheerhatch Primary would like to know, was working as a medical statistician your dream job, or did you have another? What did you want to do when you were at school?
That's good, yeah. Thank you. So I was fascinated by dinosaurs when I was at primary school, and I wanted to be an archaeologist. And I can remember for many, many years that was something that I'd like to do. As I grew up and maybe started to go through secondary school, I felt like maybe I'd like to be a teacher, and I wasn't quite sure what it was. And I was getting into maths, and then I heard about this estimate system from a maths teacher when I was in the equivalent of year 12. And I was fascinated that people could get jobs that involved maths. And so that's when I started to specialize a bit more in the sort of statistics element of it. But I have to say that that's part of the reason why I share with you today this estimate, because it did influence my choice moving away from, an archaeologist to a teacher to becoming a medical statistician.
That's great. I don't think we've got time to go through all of the questions, so I'm just going to pick one more out. So going back to your chocolate bars, have a company like Cadbury's ever got their average or mean number for chocolate bars wrong? And if so, how would they deal with this? How would they refund people or adapt the weight?
Yeah. I'm afraid, I'd actually be interested in the answer myself. Because I don't work for Cadbury's and I don't work in the industry, it would be unfair for me to comment and say what would happen in there. The best that I could say to you is that there is a branch of statistics which is, it's at university level, which is statistical process control, which they would intervene. They would stop the manufacturing if it started to give averages that were wrong. My full expectation is that Cadbury's have these process controls and they stop their factory producing a batch, work out what causes it before the products got out the door. But I fully qualify that by saying that I've never worked for Cadbury's or any other chocolate company, and you would need to ask them.
Okay, I think one final question. It's quite a nice question to end on. What was your proudest, most favourite moment in your job?
I think one of the high points was when I was the first person in the world to know whether a drug for a particular infectious disease, I won't name the infectious disease, but I worked on a particular infectious disease, and I was the first person in the world to know whether the drug worked. And I'll give you some insight to that. So when we run these so-called phase 3 studies, these are the ones that have thousands of patients around the world. Nobody knows if they got the new active experimental drug or whether they had what's called a placebo or a sugar pill. And that is deliberate because we want to try and make sure that nobody could be influenced by, oh, I know I'm on a sugar pill, I'm going to, have, no side effects and the drug's not going to work, or I know I'm on the experimental pill and I'm going to get better faster. So we call this something which is a blinded trial. So nobody knows. But at some point, you have to reveal what each patient was on. And the medical statistician is usually the first person in the world that gets to see that, the so-called breaking the blind. And so when I was working on this infectious disease, and I could see that this new treatment was going to reduce the severity of this infectious disease, I can remember being quite proud of being involved with that moment. And that medicine was submitted for drug licenses around the world, and it's been used around the world by millions and millions of people since. Now, of course, I didn't discover that medicine. I wasn't the doctors giving it to the patients, but I had just a little handle in analysing and interpreting the results and then sharing that with governments around the world.
That's great. Thank you ever so much, Nelson. I think we'll wrap up here. Thank you ever so much to all the teachers for logging on and for all the students for listening this morning. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the questions. Goodbye.